He is the director of the Science in the Public Sphere program in the Center for Communication Science at RTI International. He's on the faculty at Duke and UNC Chapel Hill, and he's also the host of a public radio show, The Measure of Everyday Life, for WNCU. Please welcome to the stage our first presenter for RTP180 Fake News, Brian Southwell.
Thanks a lot. That's the most enthusiastic introduction I've ever gotten, so I appreciate that. What a surreal time to be a social scientist studying misinformation. It's almost as though you opted to self-publish your memoir, and then you wake up one day and it's on the New York Times bestseller list. Like all of a sudden, your topic has been discovered. This is really a strange moment. The notion of misinformation is everywhere now. It's in the news as we hear about it on an almost daily basis. And in fact, we are even talking about how often we talk about it. There's been news coverage of all of our references to fake news and post-truth and misinformation. What I want to talk about in my 5 minutes, though, here, what I want to leave you with, what I want to emphasize, is that even though we've gathered here for reasons of novelty, I actually think that we need a reminder about the extent to which the situation we're in, and perhaps the way out, has very much to do with a longer-standing concern, and that is our basic humanity. So if you think about, even in the electronic media environment, there are lots of examples in the past century or so, instances where we can point to issues of inaccuracy. Look back at the run-up to the Spanish-American War, and there was some questionable accuracy in terms of some of the coverage and news articles that were published prior to that. Move ahead to about 80 years ago, in fact, exactly 80 years ago, on an October night, a fall night in 1938, and there was the War of the Worlds incident in which listeners tuned in and were fooled into thinking that Martians had invaded New Jersey. Now, with all due respect to my friends in New Jersey, the jury might still be out on that one, but it turns out that that was an incident where people heard content, believed it to be something other than, and it was the case in terms of it being true. So the question then for us is, how do we get into this situation? And are there aspects of the way that we interact with one another, of our basic humanity that might actually be partly responsible? And that's partly what I want to emphasize. My colleagues and I have had a chance to weigh in on this topic with a new book called Misinformation in Mass Audiences. In fact, there's a few copies here. We'll try and give away one at the end of the night. And in putting this together, we struggled with a couple of things. First was the ways in which we had to reach to lots of different disciplinary areas to really get our hands around all the different topics that are relevant when you consider the notion of misinformation. But the other thing was just the title, what we were going to call it. And we ended up using the word misinformation as an umbrella term. Now, a guy named Jürgen Habermas a number of years ago made a distinction and really emphasized this distinction between misinformation and disinformation. Disinformation being sort of active instances of deceit. And we think that's important, but we also think there's a lot of noise out there that may not necessarily have been put out there intentionally. And we need to pay attention to that as well. So we can think about misinformation as all of the noise that's in our information environment that we need to pay attention to. And what I want to argue tonight briefly is that there are 4 reasons why this is going to be an enduring concern. The first is that we're actually biased towards acceptance of information. The second is that we share information with one another for lots of reasons, and I'll talk about that. The third is that we have a regulatory approach in the US and in other parts of the world that actually opens the door for some of this information to appear. And the last is that correcting it is difficult to do. So on to this first point. there's been a long-standing debate as to what happens when we encounter false information. And we can turn back a couple of centuries to a debate between a few philosophers, a guy named Spinoza and another Descartes. Descartes thought that actually what we could do when we detected, for lack of a better term, BS, we could screen that out right away. We would be able to detect that. Well, Spinoza had a more subtle account. He suggested that we actually take all information in and accept it at face value, and then later tag it as being true or false. Empirical evidence actually backs up Spinoza's account, and so it leaves the door open for this possibility that in situations of fatigue or other motivation, that we might end up actually continuing to accept that information that we'd accepted at face value. Also turns out that we talk to one another, we are social beings, we connect with one another, and some of that interaction has more to do with our need for identity, our need for social bonding, than it has to do with, strictly speaking, with our need for accuracy per se. So we might think about this in terms of what we do with information as currency in trying to form bonds with other people. And that might be sometimes correspondent to the truth. In other instances, it might be not necessarily the primary concern. And so we will come back and talk about that perhaps in the Q&A. I also want to briefly note that if you stop and think about our regulatory environment, in the US, for example, we have a regulatory environment that does all kinds of wonderful and useful things. But part of what it does is post hoc detection. So you think about the information that's out there in terms of, for example, inaccurate advertising. It wasn't prevented from being on air in the first place necessarily. It was often detected, responded to. There was a request for a remedy that occurs. It's the nature of our system. And I'd argue that actually, if we had it any other way, that'd be a problem because we would have censorship in a way that we probably wouldn't be comfortable with. The last point I want to raise is that the empirical evidence on correcting misperceptions suggests that there is a pathway forward. There is possibility, there is hope. But correcting misperceptions is difficult. You have to correct it right away. You have to be explicit. You have to say there was an error. You have to essentially fight fire with fire in terms of the level and amount of exposure of the corrective message relative to what was out there with the well-funded campaign. All of those are difficult challenges that we don't often consider. That's very different than just putting out a corrective brochure somewhere and assuming that people are going to see it on a widespread basis. Okay, so what do we do then about all this? Well, part of the solution, I think, is just recognizing that part of the problem is us. That we can talk about malicious agents, we can talk about external threats, and some of that might be part of the equation, but part of the concern is that we are all human, that we have certain needs for connecting with one another, that we have certain tendencies in terms of information processing. And that's okay, but we need to recognize that as a first step. I think that there's, and I'll just, a shorthand solution that we can come back to as you think about this later driving home. I think it really matters that you know your local neighbors. I think it really matters that you build bonds of trust and connection with people that you see face-to-face, that you see in a local community, because I think that's actually a path through this as well, because they can be guides to the larger environment. And lastly, I just want to suggest here, not to open our whole discussion on a down note, but rather to suggest that actually this isn't a time to be disheartened. This is a time, though, to look in the mirror and to think about the ways that we can be part of the solutions going forward. So I think that's pretty close to 5 minutes, and with that, I'll close and take some questions, maybe.
All right, time for Q&A with Brian Southwell. Raise your hand. I'll come out, pass you the mic. You can ask him a question. Obviously, an expert in the field. People realize this isn't TV, and I can see you, right? Okay, just check. All right, we got a question here in the back. Come back here and get our first question of the evening.
Brian, where do you think satire, like things like The Onion, live in a world like this where that site is regularly believed to be true frequently?
Yeah, I really appreciate raising that question. And in fact, not to over-promote the new book, but in our new book, there's a chapter on satire and parody. My colleague, Danielle Young, up at the University of Delaware, writes about this. And in a double-edged way, she's both thinks there needs to be space for that. We have to protect that possibility. Worries, though, about the fact that there is evidence to suggest that people are taking that at face value. So part of it might be growing appreciation for satire, almost sort of increasing literacy with regards to satire as an art form. It certainly turns out to be, in a political arena, an important tool, and we wouldn't want to imagine a world where we sort of somehow ruled that out. But it's a special case, and it's one that people have started to worry about in important ways. So I direct you to Dana's work to think about what we might do about that. It's a tricky subject. Yeah.
All right, next question is back to your right here in the back row.
Considering it's a very social problem, what role should social media corporations play in remedying it?
Yeah, no, that's a good one. And so we might think about the folks that are organizing content, and the way that we tend to also think about regulation and suggestion for really emphasize my point for folks that are organizing media content in general. I think a case could be made that we have to consider social media platforms in at least the same arena as media content producers, and to consider possibilities for both self-governance, but also thinking about them as part of this discussion. They are organizing one-to-one connections, but scaling so in a way that they are accumulating mass audiences. So I think we have to view them as part of that. And that's something we might talk about further, but I think you're right to point out that possibility.
All right, last question here on your left.
2 questions, one for Wade. Did you say I get a Wolfie for asking a question? Yes.
Great.
Okay, awesome.
Now, the speakers didn't get Wolfie. I'm not sure how this works, but that's...
Incentive. Second question, I was just curious to hear more about this idea of knowing your neighbors and how that relates. I wanted to hear more about that.
Yeah. So we worry a lot about what's happening in terms of the peer-to-peer spread of misinformation. But we might also think about the peer-to-peer relationships we have as building blocks as a way forward. We actually don't spend as much time thinking about ways in which neighborhoods and communities can be helpful guides toward the larger information environment. I actually worry about the extent to which we've all become atomized to some extent, connected by our cell phones to a larger, more amorphous national, international culture without necessarily those direct connections. And so in a lot of ways, there are possibilities for trust building, possibilities for verification of information that are possible in those kind of relationships that from both a political and a civic perspective, and in terms of this larger concern, I just think there's a lot of value in that. So events like this where we are connecting with one another, I hope that it's not just a matter of broadcasting out messages, but you all are talking to each other after and getting to know each other. Great.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Brian Southwell.